we've got a special full-length documentary for you in regards to the remote viewing project. We're speaking with Lance Munguia, the filmmaker behind Third Eye Spies. We've been working on this for 2 weeks now, and we are excited to also have Russel Targ, who shares his insight in regards to the secret program. It's our pleasure to share it with you right now, exclusive on Third Phase of Moon.
One time we had a small plane go down somewhere in Africa, and we were not able to find it by surveillance. So the director of the CIA heard about a woman in California that was a medium or something. I don't know the title for. And she gave him the latitude and longitude of the plane's whereabouts. We located the plane where she said it was. And that's the only time that I have ever experienced something that was inexplicable while I was present.
My name is Russel Targ, and I'm a physicist, and it's my privilege today to be able to tell you about the true story of CIA psychic spying during the Cold War.
We began by speaking of some kind of almost a psychic arms race here. Is there any real application to this?
We worked for 20 years at Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California, and we were working on helping people get in touch with the part of themselves that's psychic, so they can quiet their mind and describe and experience what's going on at distant places and in the future. And the most important thing we learned in coherence with modern physics is that psychic functioning as we see it is a non-local ability. By non-local, I mean it's no more difficult to describe what's going on in Soviet Siberia than it is to describe what's going across the street here in Palo Alto. And the most interesting thing that I've learned, the most interesting thing that I can tell you about, is that it's no harder to describe what's going on hours or days in the future than it is to describe a contemporaneous event.
This may reassure you, it may alarm you, but in fact, for some years now, the U.S. intelligence community has wagered a modest amount of money on the possibility that such powers do exist. Such powers do exist.
If you were going to hide someplace in the next few hours and hadn't decided where you're going, I could sit with a friend or a psychic, and she could quiet her mind, draw a little picture that describes where you're going to be, and we have found that it's no more difficult to describe where you're going to be in the hidden future than it is for you to describe at a contemporaneous place where you are, where you will be shortly.
When I was a kid, I read a Reader's Digest article that talked about the U.S. Army using psychics to spy. And I thought that that was like the coolest thing I'd ever heard. And that sparked my interest, and I followed the subject. There wasn't as much information about it back then. Even back then, though, I thought that this would make such a cool movie someday. So I kept the article for years, and I followed the subject as much as I could.
If you had an ability to be able to remotely perceive stuff any place in the world, that could be an extraordinary intelligence source.
We found that many individuals are able to accurately describe what's going on in distant locations.
Are you saying that the work you've been doing is classified?
It was a research facility. That was all that we were going to tell them.
The Russians have been spending millions of dollars investigating so-called ESP.
Psychic spies. Almost a psychic arms race here. Is there any real application to this?
I think remote viewing has been demonstrated over the 20 years of work that's been sponsored by the government. producing crucial and vital intelligence to the NSA, CIA, DEA, and the Secret Service.
I began to feel frightened.
The KGB did it, man.
What's really going on here? State-sponsored assassination attempt.
The CIA was lying.
They wanted to kill the program.
A storm brewing.
This is real.
I say no more secrets.
Let this information out.
Remote viewing is the ability to see outside of space and time, to experience information that is otherwise hidden, using only the power of your own mind. I know how that sounds. It sounds crazy, okay, but let me explain. What scientists working in this field hypothesize is that somehow all of us are connected to all other points in space and time through our own consciousness. And our imagination, I believe, acts as sort of an engine of this. Wherever you can imagine your focus, wherever you can focus your attention, we can get impressions. We can develop an idea of what is there. Now, these impressions, they're not literal, usually. So you aren't supposed to name it. You just write everything down. Sometimes this ability corresponds to a person's natural ability in other areas. An artist may see scenery. A musician may use sound. An engineer may be very good at drawing schematics. It's a very personal skill.
The Scan8 program was started by Ingo Swann, and in that program, where we were using coordinate remote viewing, a viewer described what was located at any geographical coordinate of latitude and longitude, and would then describe what's there.
It seems too easy. I asked him, why don't you teach more? He says, Russel says, I don't teach because it's just too easy to do. You teach someone how to do it one time and they can do it. We once found a guy that could see anywhere in the world through his psychic powers. We could show him a picture of any place and he could describe any activity going on there. But he died, and we haven't heard from him since. CIA Director Stansfield Turner, Chicago Tribune, August 1977.
I also built a ESP teaching machine with the idea that if you offered a person feedback and reinforcement, they could get in touch with what it feels like when they're using their psychic abilities. And I eventually showed that to Werner von Braun at a conference on speculative technology, and von Braun did very well on this four-choice gadget, and he showed it to James Fletcher, who was the administrator of NASA. And Fletcher said, well, if you're doing well on this thing, Werner, maybe we could offer these guys a few bucks to go forward. And Edgar Mitchell was at this conference also. So I just found 3 new friends, Werner von Braun, Jim Fletcher, the administrator of NASA, and Edgar Mitchell, and we got a contract that moved me from Sylvania making lasers to Stanford Research Institute to build a ESP teaching machine. And this machine is now available as a free application from the Apple iStore. So your goal is to press the button that rings the bell, and that shows that you're somewhat in touch with your future feedback.
The remote viewing program basically ran from the early 70s to the mid-90s.
For more than 20 years, the CIA used psychic abilities operationally and in a top secret program for the US government. You paid for them, you deserve to see them.
Remote viewing doesn't seem to be a very rare ability. It doesn't mean that everybody is a virtuoso, a genius at this. Some people, you may just be able to tease out a little tune or something. But other people, like some of the people that we feature in our film, a rare few might be like Mozart. Or in the case of our film, Third Eye Spies, in particular, like Pat Price. Pat Price, who could psychically stick his head inside a filing cabinet and pull classified names out. That begs the question, can this guy maybe remote view the nuclear codes? Can he review my bank account numbers? I'm sure that question really freaked a lot of people out.
We sat down with our coffee and I said, here's the target, Pat. What do you see?
Next morning, they came back with a sketch.
And we showed him the picture.
So I go over and I say, well, I've got this science fiction fantasy crane.
Now, before we go into a panic, that said, according to Ken Kress and the CIA's data, there's a lot of signal to noise ratio in remote viewing. There's a lot of BS mixed in with the good stuff. The human consciousness is not linear. It's not like the way that you would use a computer where the answer just comes out. The results are very tricky because you have to filter out your own thoughts and your own filters, your consciousness.
And he unrolled a big picture of an R&D facility, and right in the middle of this facility was a photograph of a giant gantry crane.
From the sketch from the photographic image. He said, oh, this was a huge crane. He said, I saw somebody walk by and the guy only came up to the axle or something on the wheels, or up to the top of the wheels. Pat, what do you see about underground?
He said one of the big things they're doing here is making these 60-foot spheres out of steel. They're actually 58 feet.
They finally rolled out a 60-foot diameter steel sphere that's part of a containment vessel for a particle beam weapon to shoot down American surveillance satellites. Exactly what Price described. CIA was interested to know if we could find people who are hiding someplace, or describe what the laboratory is in Soviet Siberia. So we had an unclassified portion of a program at Stanford Research Institute. The unclassified portion was playing psychic hide-and-go-seek in Menlo Park and building an ESP teaching machine. The classified portion was working with 3 great psychics, one of whom was Ingo Swann, who had been psychic all of his life. And he steered us in the direction of something he called remote viewing. Remote viewing is an ability we all have that allows us to quiet our mind, look into the distance, look into the future, and find out what's going on there.
As we were doing these experiments, we began to run into flack from the psychologists at SRI. They said, you've got that crazy ESP experiments going on. That's going to ruin our reputation. We're going to lose our funding. Get rid of those guys. I had access to one of the most shielded experiments on the planet. It was a shielded magnetometer that measures weak magnetic fields.
And what you had to learn is to separate the psychic signal, which corresponds to the distant location, separate that psychic signal from the mental noise, which is your memory and imagination of what it could possibly be. And we found that people were able to do that with surprising skill. It turns out easier to describe where a person is hiding anywhere on the planet, that I could be visiting anywhere on the planet and it's a place that you don't know. You then surrender and agree to not guess, because I've told you you don't know this place. So I ask you to describe the surprising image that comes into your awareness. And once a person agrees, I'm not going to guess, I'm just going to tell you about my images, it becomes very easy for them to describe the place. how would it be if we spent half of our time on operational targets for the CIA and half of our time doing research? And he said, I understand what you want to do. That would be fair.
Everybody knew that there had to be some foundational science or this stuff would never be accepted.
Ingo Swann died about a year before I met Russel. And Russel was already thinking about ways to preserve the testimony of the people who had been involved in the CIA's remote viewing programs before they all eventually passed away. He told me that he had never really been able to tell the whole story before, and that he had worked for many years to get the basic parts of what he and his partner, Hal Puthoff, had discovered declassified. He'd only succeeded in more recent years when his son and he approached people in Congress and approached former allies in the government to get it declassified. What actually stressed me out the most about it, and the thing that we discussed, was whether there would be repercussions from making this kind of a film. From the CIA or from other agencies, we didn't know whether we were discussing things that they may still be doing. We didn't know what the danger level of that was.
The first series of experiments here at Stanford Research Institute were what the scientists called remote viewing.
You can actually take out of thin air information about something you have absolutely no access to, just using your mind.
In Pat Price's drawings, it was as if it was from inside his brain.
It was obvious to any intelligence organization that if you had an ability to be able to remotely perceive stuff, really remotely, like any place in the world, that could be an extraordinary intelligence source.
And I have to admit that at first I really didn't know what to think. I was overwhelmed by the enormity of the story, and it seemed too good to be true. Even though I had read things about the remote viewing program that the government did, I was really skeptical at what I was hearing, because frankly, it was just all too much to take in.
We brought in 1% of the money and 99% of the publicity.
Back in 1972, SRI was primarily a contractor for the government and some industry. With the riots in the late 60s, early 70s, the fact that classified work was going on at Stanford University, they didn't like that.
What Russell's remote viewers were getting was too accurate, and if anything, I've never lost my sense of discernment, a sense that you can be enlightened, but you must still be an enlightened skeptic, something like that. I was very careful to make sure that the stories in this film would be corroborated by multiple sources. I didn't want us to look like we were just putting something out there that wasn't verified.
It's natural for a visually handicapped person like me to be interested in optics, magic, and extrasensory perception. I'm a legally blind motorcycle riding physicist. In 1934, I was born in Chicago. I was a child magician. I used to perform magic tricks at birthday parties and art openings. As a magician, I understand how people can be tricked. That's always made me a better researcher, especially in a field like ESP. We did not invent remote viewing. Remote viewing was understood for thousands of years. Hindu teacher Patanjali, 400 years before Christ, Patanjali was saying that when you quiet your mind, you can see into the distance, see into the future, diagnose illnesses, and heal the sick. I left graduate school at Columbia in 1956, and in 1958, I began working on the earliest development of the laser. I was looking for a way to get into some kind of psychical research and still support my family. I heard that there was going to be a lecture at Stanford University, and there was a young physicist, Hal Puthoff, giving a lecture on psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain, American and Russian ESP. And I then went back and talked to my new friend Hal Puthoff and said, I think I got some dough. Let's talk to your management about creating a program. And he said, that would be very nice. You just have to promise that you'll keep a low profile. So that was in June of 1972. And this led to the beginning of our program at SRI to investigate psychic abilities. I look forward to coming to work. Every day had a new miracle. I feel like the child magician finally got a job doing magic. So the idea of having a top secret program teaching timeless awareness, I always thought was a little ill-conceived. But in our program, we worked with Ingo Swann, who is the New York artist who invented remote viewing in the current era. We worked with Pat Price, who was a retired police commissioner, who was the first truly psychic person that I ever experienced or worked with. We would have lunch with Pat Price during the Nixon years, and he would say, don't worry, we'll soon be rid of Nixon, and that vice president guy is going to go also. We're going to get rid of both of them. At one point in our program, where Price was very successful at describing where people were hiding in the Bay Area. In fact, one series of experiments that we published in Nature magazine, every day for 9 days, my partner, Hal Puthoff, would hide somewhere in the Bay Area in a randomly chosen place that I didn't know anything about. And each day I would sit with Price, and Price would describe what it looked like where Hal was hiding. And at the end of 9 days, a psychologist would try and match up Price's 9 drawings with the traveling instructions that Hal had to go there. And Price was able to match 7 out of those 9 in first place match. What that means is that if Hal had been kidnapped 9 days in a row by terrorists, and Pat Price was asked to find him, Price would have found him the first place he looked in 7 out of the 9 trials. Highly significant, amazing psychic feat. Ingo is really the father of remote viewing in the modern era. Before Ingo, people were describing the picture in the envelope. He said, if I want to see what's in the envelope, I'll open the envelope. I can focus my attention anywhere on the planet, give me something interesting to look at.
And he threatened to quit. And so we asked him, well, you know, what do you mean? What would you like to do? And he says, just send somebody out in the San Francisco Bay Area and I'll describe where they are.
For example, here is a reenactment of one of the first experiments last year. The subject was a New York artist named Ingo Swann. He was in the room. The experimenters, Drs. Harold Puthoff and Russel Targ, were driving away in a car. Their destination was in a sealed envelope. This day it was Palo Alto City Hall. The subject did not know. But back in the room, the subject began sketching and describing where he imagined they might be. Here was the tape recording that he made then.
There must be buildings around, and this would be sort of an area enclosed of some sort, a quadrangle or a quad. And then I sort of felt that there might be a fountain around, but I didn't hear any water in it.
There is a fountain. That day, it was turned off. Back in the room, the subject sketched a pattern he thought was crosswalks coming together in a circle. In fact, the courtyard is paved in this pattern. The courtyard where they were is 2 miles from the room where the subject was. There had been no communication between them.
Swann claimed that he could move the needle of an unswayable magnetometer, buried under 30 feet of concrete, with a classified design used to sniff out nuclear explosions.
It even had superconducting shielding. Its claim to fame was that nothing from the outside could affect it.
Not only could Ingo perfectly sketch the design, but the needle moved, and nearly got them kicked out of Stanford for breaking the experiment. And that got the attention of the CIA.
It took Russell 2 days for him to get to the part of his story that all of this successful data he had gathered was available via Freedom of Information Act, and that there had been extensive congressional hearings, and that the SRI team had allies in the Senate and in the House and in cabinets of several different presidents. And finally, even that Jimmy Carter himself had verified one of their most spectacular operational successes. Russell's original ESP research was done at Sylvania Laser Labs, and this was long before SRI. It was shut down by Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General at the time, and he had gotten a set of complaints from religious conservatives who had written letters to Kennedy after Sylvania ran an ad in a newspaper looking for ESP subjects. Russell was a brilliant scientist. He was working at Sylvania studying and building lasers. He was a pioneer of the lasers. Russell's the reason why a 747 knows to go lower or higher in turbulence in that laser that goes out there. He invented that. So why would he waste his time trying to hoax you or me?
The CIA then thought they would expand Price's horizon. They gave us a task of describing what was at a location in the Soviet Union. It was some kind of Soviet R&D facility is what we knew. What's at the slip of paper? Price said, "I'm lying on top of a building. The sun is shining. This giant crane is rolling back and forth over my body. It's a really huge crane. I have to draw this crane." And I can show you a picture of what he drew. We then were asked to look inside the building, or Pat was asked to look inside the building. And he described some giant steel spheres under construction. They were 60 feet in diameter, and he described that they were being put together from orange peel slices that were out of gores. They're being welded together into these giant steel spheres. And nobody knew anything about them, so that was just considered a miss. We don't know anything about steel spheres. Price died the following year, and the year after that, 2 years after Price died, the building was opened up, and we learned from unclassified sources, and it was later confirmed in classified sources, that the Russians were building giant steel spheres, and they appear in photographs. So that Price was able to describe something that existed contemporaneously that nobody knew about in the Western world. And our reward for that is that we had a congressional hearing as to how could we have possibly gotten that information. And the CIA was so impressed with Price's ability at describing the details of a Soviet weapons factory that they moved Price from SRI to Virginia to become a contractor for the CIA, day after day working with our contract monitor, Ken Kress. And he was becoming just an adjunct person working with the CIA. And he unfortunately died 4 months after leaving SRI.
Pat Price died in 1975, and some people believe it was because of his work with remote viewing.
CIA hired Price away from us, and 4 months after joining the CIA, Price was dead.
And the big question is, was he killed or was it a natural death?
Like in the movies, you want to know, did he jump or was he pushed?
What do you think?
The emergency department people said that there was an individual that came in with him with a briefcase that showed the attending physician in the emergency room his recent EKGs from Greenbrier, which was the facility that I knew that we'd taken him to get his cardiological workup. some months ago and basically said, look, here's the guy had rampant serious coronary artery disease. He had a heart attack, so even though he died unattended in a hotel room, they decided, they meaning the hospital and the police, to not make it a medical examiner case. So they didn't do an autopsy, although that's not correct. And the man disappeared with the briefcase, with the notes. They never took any records of it. Body was removed and cremated. And then they called his wife.
I know a little more about this story.
That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you.
People who are so valuable are never taken out. They tempt them with amazing circumstantial or monies, dwellings, houses to work for them. They will never. This is like killing the goose that lays golden eggs.
I saw Pat shortly before he was killed. He was coming to see us.
Yes.
But before he left, he called several of his friends to say goodbye in an odd way.
So in short, he predicted his own death.
And he purchased a $1 million term life insurance to give to his wife Anne at the airport.
You see, I didn't know that. Interesting.
And he's changed his trip to visit his son in Salt Lake.
Maybe he had a psychic feeling that he was about to die. He must have been one of the greatest psychics in the world.
Yes.
Some Army remote viewers tasked themselves on Price's death years later and decided he was still alive and at work. Of course, this was just speculation.
It was entirely unmarked. He deserves better than that. With the death of Price, the CIA wanted us to find someone to work with who was not a famous psychic. Could we find somebody who was willing to take part in a ESP experiment at Stanford Research Institute, but we didn't want somebody who had been doing this all of their lives. And I asked my good friend Hella Hamid, who was a distinguished American photographer. She was born in Germany. Very intelligent, thoughtful woman for all seasons. You could take her anywhere. Very competent woman. And she thought it would be amusing to leave her Los Angeles gig and come to California, come to SRI once a month and be paid to be a psychic for the CIA. How entertaining could that be?
October 11th, 1974. It's 20 minutes to 4 in the afternoon. Russ Targ and Hella Hamid are in the First Royal Laboratory at SRI. Hal has left SRI. He will select a randomly chosen destination.
I was looking up at this structure that must be 3-4 stories high. A weird zigzag going horizontally like a series of mountains, sort of peaks on top of each other, can be just shapes. The side of the structure seems to be open to the sky too. Squares within squares within squares, going downward like into a trough. It's definitely some kind of a conduit.
This is just where Hal Puthoff was standing at the time of Hella Hamid's very first remote viewing.
Perhaps the most dangerous secret of all, the one that Russel Targ has worked his whole life to release, is that anybody can be psychic.
So Hella came and agreed to work with us, and her drawings looked pretty good. And in fact, at the end of 9 trials, where we're playing psychic hide-and-go-seek, I would interview Hella, and Hal would go and hide somewhere. Hella's descriptions were even more statistically significant than Pat Price's. Hella's was significant at odds of 1,000,000 to 1, and we published her findings together with Price in the Institute of Electrical Engineer Proceedings in 1976. So we had a major review article called Information Transmission, and it turned out that Hella had done, even as a so-called control subject, had done even, although her drawings were not as detailed as Price, her signals were unencumbered by noise. She didn't put in things that she didn't recognize. So although she didn't have the classy drawings that Price's gave us, her signal to noise was superior. And in the matching by the psychologist, it turned out that hers were even more significant than Price.
I learned right away that remote viewing and the study of it is not one large voice. There's a lot of difference of opinion about it, even within the field of study itself. It's too easily dismissed because there's no mechanism that shows how something like psychic ability works every single time. And the best data was classified. And it was marked automatic do not downgrade for decades. In fact, the very nature of consciousness and the observer effect tells us that you're not ever going to get exactly the same results every time. The observer is the experiment.
Remote viewing is not limited to looking into the distance and looking into the future on this planet. Ingo Swann was once sitting with me in my office during our NASA program. We were building this ESP teaching machine for NASA, where our contract monitor, George Pesdertz, just looked over and said, you know, we're sending a Pioneer spacecraft to Jupiter, Ingo. Can you tell us anything that we're going to find at Jupiter when the spacecraft gets there in a year from now? And Ingo said, well, can take a look and see what's there. Has a puff on his cigar. And he said, yeah, you know, there's a big fat ring of ice crystals all the way around Jupiter. I never noticed that before. And George said, you're thinking of Saturn, aren't you, Ingo? And Ingo said, I've been looking at space for a lifetime. Let me tell you, I know the difference between Jupiter and Saturn. I'm looking at Jupiter here, and when your spacecraft gets there, you'll take a nice picture and you'll show a big fat ring of ice crystal all the way around Jupiter, and you can then show that to me when the photos get back to Earth. And in fact, a year and a half later, the images were produced by NASA and greatly resemble the drawings that Ingo Swann made.
Our innate intuitive ability is our birthright. That is what the players that have been involved with this believe, and you know, through the interviews I've found, through research, you know, that they've been done. It's really something that a person has to make their own mind up about. Joe McMoneagle says in one of his books, you can't take away someone's worldview without giving them something else. Well, the fact that someone can close their eyes and see not only anywhere else on the planet, but maybe even to other spots in the solar system or beyond, is a very different worldview. Ingo Swann showed that he was able to remote view the rings around Jupiter 6 months before the probe got there, the first one. Nobody knew that was possible. You can't explain something like that away. And what it suggests is profound. I mean, it's truly profound in terms of who we are as human beings and what we're actually capable of. If remote viewing shows us that we are all fundamentally connected in some way, then in a certain sense, we can all learn to walk a little bit in another person's shoes. Maybe we start to care more a little bit about each other, about our planet. Maybe it makes us think of the universe as a more magical place. Anything can be used for good or ill. And I thought a lot about that in this documentary too. I had a quiet moment with Hal Puthoff, Russel Targ's partner in this program, and he said something to me that didn't make it into the film. He said, I asked him if he was concerned about having worked for so long in the intelligence agencies that maybe using the intel his team provided for violent ends to kill the enemy. He said he has always believed that intelligence never causes wars. Ignorance does. The ignorance of what is happening in the world continually leads to war. This is more true today, I think, than it ever has been. It seems like our society revels in its own ignorance, and we are comfortable in what we don't know. You see people denying the evidence of their own eyes every day, explaining away the most obvious things because it doesn't fit their particular worldview. I mean, you can take the UFO phenomenon. A pilot sees something and he doesn't want to talk about it because it may stigmatize him. It's not convenient. People are just comfortable in their ignorance, and I think our film does a lot to shake that up.
Remote Viewer 001 was Joe McMoneagle. After the death of Pat Price and the very successful series of remote viewings by Hella Hamid, the Army said, you know, we're getting tired of having you guys at SRI give us all the answers. It's embarrassing whenever we have to find a hostage or a kidnapped person or a downed airplane, we have to come to California. Could you train some people in the Army at INSCOM, Army Intelligence Command? And Hal Potoff and I interviewed 30 people at a big gymnasium and chose 6 of the 6 Army officers who are willing to risk their officer status, their professional status, to learn about psychic abilities at SRI. And of those, the first one that I actually chose was Joe McMoneagle, who had told me about experiences he had had in Vietnam that made me convinced that he was already having psychic experiences. So when he came to SRI,
Chief Warrant Officer Joe McMoneagle.
The Stanford Art Museum was Joe McMoneagle's first ever remote viewing. We then did 5 more trials with him. Altogether, we did 36 trials with the 6 Army volunteers. Out of the 36 trials, these officers were able to get 19 first-place matches, where one would expect only 6 by chance. The odds of such an excellent result is better than 1 in a million. And Joe did remarkable things. He was the first to identify a huge Soviet submarine, a Typhoon-class submarine, twice the size of anything that existed previously, and he was able to show that the submarine was constructed by pushing the hulls of 2 submarines together, making something twice the width of the other. And Joe knew about that half a year before it was launched. And he went on to do other very remarkable things and is still working.
If you think about it, everybody has psychic intuitions. It's a normal part of who we are as human beings. And it's something that we just tend to overlook or to chalk up as nothing. But it's a gut feeling. You know when somebody's about to call you. You know that your aunt is sick in Detroit. Whatever it is. Maybe though we think of it as scary or evil or just plain crazy. More than anything else, nobody wants to play the fool. Nobody wants to be wrong. But maybe the biggest thing that's wrong with our planet right now is that we are also set in what we really think that reality is. We have our perceptions and we don't like those to change. Nobody wants to upset the apple cart. Third Eye Spies is going to upset the apple cart, and rightfully so. And I'm happy to and honored to have been a part of that process in some small way.
Contained critical intelligence reported at the highest echelons of our military and government, including such national-level agencies as the Joint Chiefs of Staff, DIA, NSA, CIA, DEA, and the Secret Service, producing crucial and vital intelligence unavailable from any other source.
Science should not be about what we know. It should always be open to the possibilities of what we don't know. To me, that's good science. Galileo stood on a street corner and showed his telescope to people, and no one would look through it because they didn't want anything to upset their world. And at the same time, you've got guys like James Randi running around for years debunking spoon bending. James Randi made a documentary, and he talks about Russel and Hal Puthoff taking Uri Geller on a spoon bending trip around the world after they couldn't prove that he could do it in the lab.
Everybody knew that there had to be some foundational science or this stuff would never be accepted.
Stanford Research Institute has been conducting an experimental program in the field of psychoenergetic effect.
I had Hal and Russ bring Uri Geller to me, who was supposedly one of the psychokinetic people who could take and bend setups.
15 drawings were placed in double-sealed envelopes in a safe for which none of the experimenters had the combination. This is Geller's representation of what he believed was sealed in the envelope. This is the most off-target of the drawings that he did. As you can see, he is quite elated about getting the right answer.
But he never mentions remote viewing. Why? And the way, and by the way, they didn't take Uri Geller on a trip around the world. He was at SRI for 6 weeks. He demonstrated remote viewing, he moved on, and then SRI did 20 years of operational work. But I share the skeptic's mind. I'm always looking for what the angle could be. Is this sleight of hand? But how can you debunk a guy like Pat Price, who looks up secret codes and locked filing cabinets 1,000 miles away, or Soviet beam weapons, which he describes to the inch, that nobody in U.S. intelligence knows about until years after the guy's dead? That's not sleight of hand.
Early in our program, 1974, Patricia Hearst was kidnapped from her apartment very close to UC Berkeley. She lived there with her boyfriend, and the terrorists from the SLA broke into their little apartment and kidnapped the heiress and held her ransom, as many of you know, to raise money to feed the poor. And before we knew anything about that, Pat Price was called in, and he said, I want you to know this is not an ordinary kidnapping for money, but these people have some other kind of humanitarian goals, some political goal. And when Hal and I went with Pat Price to the police station in Berkeley, I remember the policeman told Price, we have a lot of questions we want to ask you. We know that you're a policeman. And Price said, let me tell you how we do this. Give me a mug book. I want to see a mug book of your, basically a picture book of the usual suspects. And Price turned the pages of this big book, and he eventually got to a page. He put his finger on one guy, undistinguished from the other, dozens and dozens of pictures. He said, that guy is a ringleader. And he was able to put his finger on Donald DeVries, who was in fact the ringleader, known at that time as Sin Q. So that's one of the most psychic things they've ever seen. No one knew who the ringleader of this group was, and Price just pulled him as though by magic out of this big picture book of possible people. And Price said, I suppose you want to find the car. I see the car. It's about 50 miles north of here on the left side of the road. It's a white station wagon across from some gas storage cylinders. And the police discharged a cruiser, and they were able to find the car right where Price sent them. Of course, the kidnappers had already left that site, and we provide other assistance to them that was corroborated, and we got a commendation from the Berkeley Police Department, but unfortunately a lot of people were killed in the meantime, and we cooperated with the Berkeley Police Department, but unfortunately, the FBI and the Alameda Sheriff's Department were not cooperating with the police department. Is the idea that everybody wanted the honor of finding the heiress, and much as with the lead up to 9/11, the various institutional police entities weren't cooperating with each other, and they managed to get to Los Angeles without getting captured. A big tragedy, obviously.
Something like that is not about judging or whether you got a good report or somebody let some information slip. You can't explain something like that using the world model of science that we know and understand. And I don't think that it was propaganda either. And I've asked that question many times. I honestly believe that Pat spooked the spooks, and he should have. It should make any rational person who cares about science and who honors the human spirit to sit up and ask a few questions about what their reality is. Yet, we don't see enough of that. You know, we just Google the answer and let, you know, whatever volunteer happens to be on Wikipedia that day do our homework for us. You know, it's become a soundbite society that doesn't actually research and do the work. Who was Pat Price? That's the question. Pat Price was a phenomenon. Kit Green, the SRI project contract monitor for CIA and the former head of CIA Life Sciences, told me that Pat was so incredible as a psychic that he wasn't even sure that Pat Price was human. Now, I disagree with that, because I think that even though there's enough evidence over the decades to show that Pat was psychic, he was probably just at the top of a bell curve. Pat Price was a phenomenon. Kit Green, the SRI project's former contract monitor for CIA and former head of life sciences there, told me that Pat was so incredible as a remote viewer that he wasn't sure that Pat Price was human. Now, I disagree, because I think that there's enough evidence over decades of research everywhere from Duke University to Princeton to SRI that Pat was just part of a bell curve. You know, it was a human ability that he was really good at, not superhuman, but he was scary good at what he was doing. Pat Price was a police commissioner in Burbank, and Pat was the guy who detectives who had tough cases would go to when they had a really tough case. And they would give him a map of the city, for example, and they would say, find me the car thief that just stole this car. And then he'd point to the map where he thought that the criminal was hiding. And more often than not, he was right. I actually spoke with the police officers who found the car that Pat had pointed out using remote viewing during the Patty Hearst kidnapping. I spoke to them on the phone, and Pat described the getaway car for Patty Hearst, even the shell casings on the floor. These two officers went out and they found the car right where Pat said it would be. Stanford Research Institute got a commendation from the Berkeley Police Department for that. But they didn't find Patty Hearst because lack of communication, I guess, between FBI and local authorities. But you're talking about a guy in Pat Price who had maps of the oceans above his desk and would move the pins around and then track the submarines just for fun. That's according to Ken Kress. And there's a lot of people that say that he psychically predicted his own death, and I've talked to a few that actually received calls from him. Pat bought a life insurance policy to give to his wife at the airport a couple of days before he died. He called all of his friends and very oddly said goodbye. To understand Pat, you have to know that the CIA actually stole Pat away from SRI because they didn't trust that SRI was telling them the truth. They didn't believe the incredible nature of what was happening. They thought that somehow they were faking it. Ken Kress, who was the head of the program at the time and undercover, he comes forward for the first time in Third Eye Spies to tell the story of our film, to tell the story in film. We spent a week with Ken Kress where he lives in Yellowstone, and it was incredible hanging out with him because you got to see what a grounded, ordinary person that Ken is. He obviously is a no-nonsense guy who has absolutely nothing to gain from telling us any of this. You can tell that the stories that he experienced haunted this guy for years. And you can see that even after all of these years, he was still trying to work it out in his head. He told us that the CIA felt that they couldn't trust Russel or SRI, so they pulled the plug on the SRI program and they brought Pat directly into CIA as an agent. He was an agent of the CIA. They moved Pat Price to a farm in Virginia, and they gave him a cover as a coal mine manager. And they sequestered him on this farm for many months. They didn't trust him, and they wanted to make sure that his information wasn't coming from somewhere else. So they monitored him the entire time, and at the same time, they gave him harder and harder tasks to accomplish. Now, they had him work on things finally that nobody else knew about. And time again, Pat proved that he was for real, that he could see things anywhere and everywhere. He wasn't always correct in all of the details. He would spout out a lot of things that they could not verify. But finally, they found some things in an embassy and in a training camp for terrorists that he identified that absolutely nobody knew about. And they looked there and they found it, and it was convincing. And then shortly after that, Pat Price died.
Well, everybody would like to know if there's an agency conducting remote viewing. In our film, in Third Eye Spies, we talked to Kit Green about that on camera, and he said it would be unlikely, based on all the data that we had so far, that there would be no continuation. In fact, two of the people that we tested during our long history were two people from the CIA that I trained and did very well. And we learned from Kit, after Price came to the CIA, he was working with the two people that I trained. So it's as though they're off to the side, they had this little book club at the CIA where Pat and these two agents were working together, working on targets. Kit said, to the best of his knowledge, they're probably still doing something at the CIA.
It came out shortly after Pat's death that he was giving his church classified briefings. At least that's how they interpreted it. Now, it could also have just been that he was going to confession. I don't know. But this turns Ken Kress red every time he talks about it. When he found this out after Pat's death, it tainted his view of what Pat Price had done. It was a big reason why for many years Ken would not even discuss it. Yet Ken could not deny the facts of what had happened, and it was obvious to me that he was still really trying to figure it all out.
I think it's still a question of what it means to be really human and what it means to be a proper human being, whatever that might mean, and what is the essence of who we are. And I think that if the world actually had an access to that answer, I think it would change everything.
A young physicist, Hal Puthoff, giving a lecture on psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain, American and Russian ESP. Some dough. Let's talk to your management about creating a program.
Down on the table, Paraphysics R&D, Warsaw Pact from the Defense Intelligence Agency. When I thumbed through that and saw all the work that was going on.
So the CIA was tracking all of these people.
Yeah, in this case it was DIA.
Finally wrote that summarized everything we could find at that time, and it was called Key Intelligence Question number 9. I labeled it paraphysics because I had to find a word that allowed us at the Foreign Technology Division, in a sense, You can use it for communications, like to remote places, submarines, and that came up later. I thought they'd laugh me out of the room.
So what was their reaction when you
Positive.
said that? It was
positive.
The cabin. 100 meters down the road, I found a dirt road from the cabin. I drove down it, found a guardhouse, found a dish, found the accordion door.
This naval installation's purpose is to perform communications research and development for the U.S. Navy, the Department of Defense, and various elements of the U.S. government.
Super secret facility for picking up Russian satellite information as it went overhead. And so both of them said, maybe that's what they want us to describe.
In the 1960s, Sugar Grove became one of the NSA's most important Cold War listening facilities. And then the whole thing blew up.
SRI stands for the Stanford Research Institute. It is one of the most prestigious scientific laboratories in the world. They primarily do contract work for the government. It was, hands down, the biggest laboratory that parapsychologists ever had the ability to work with. And I believe that is probably why they got really good results, as Charlie Tart says in our film. Because the lab just looked impressive, results were expected. It was a permission slip. It was telling the subjects it's okay to be psychic. Not only is it okay, but you're expected to be psychic. They would pull people in from other laboratories, sometimes just scientists, and some of them turned out to be their best remote viewers. And a few of those people that I spoke with have still not come forward today, and they're nervous about it.
If I have a document on my desk that I consider highly sensitive and classified, that there could be some Russian psychic 1,000 miles away reproducing what I'm looking at. The Russians have been spending millions of dollars over a decade at some of their best institutes investigating so-called ESP. No scientists in America even believe there's such a thing as ESP.
Can remote viewing be used to see the future or the past? Yes, remote viewing can be used to see both future and past. If you speak with people like Daryl Bem at Cornell or Dean Radin at Noetics Institute, who are both researchers into USP, or Russell, they'll tell you that it is far easier to see the past or the present, the past or the future, rather than the present.
So all hell broke loose for Kit Green. The NSA wanted to know from Kit, you're a high-level agency person at the CIA, why are you targeting your California psychics on this most secret thing in America, which is a listening post, listening to Soviet microwave signals bouncing off the moon? Why would you target your California psychics on this guy, on this site? And of course, Kit Green's answer was, I wasn't targeting it on the Sugar Grove facility. I was targeting on my friend's log cabin just on the other side of the hill from Sugar Grove. I didn't know that Sugar Grove was there. So it was just, as Price, we had a little heartfelt meeting with Hal and me and Price and Kit Green and the NSA. NSA guy asked Price, if you're so psychic and they targeted you on the log cabin, why did you describe the Sugar Grove microwave facility? And Price said, well, the more attention you focus on hiding something, the more it shines like a beacon in psychic space. And as I came in at 50,000 feet over this facility, the thing shining like a beacon was the Sugar Grove facility and not the guy's log cabin.
U.S. intelligence did not know exactly what China was going to do with what they were building in the desert. Ingo Swann and another viewer, whom out of respect I won't name because he has not come forward, and after I spoke with him he specifically told me that he did not want to come forward. they both looked at this target where this site was in China. Interestingly, Ingo got the test completely accurately 3 days in advance. He figured out that they were going to have a successful test of a nuclear weapon. On the other hand, the other viewer got a different result and suggested that the test would happen, but that the test would be nuclear, but it would be a failure. So now we have two competing things here. US intelligence didn't know what specifically they were doing, so in a sense, both of the viewers got nukes and they got it right, but the results differed. Ingo got the actual result, the other viewer was just looking at a possibility. This is a problem that associated remote viewers, like in the ones that the gambling experiments do often find. They're trying to predict the outcomes ahead of time. And oftentimes, different remote viewers will see accurate but different interpretations of the results. It's like as if they're looking at the possibilities, the different timelines, and maybe they're not always looking at the same timeline, suggesting that both outcomes could have been possible. I think that if we use our imagination, it's not hard to imagine that someone somewhere in government is still doing it. Kit Green, who is our former contract monitor for CIA, believes that they're still doing it. Not in CIA, but somewhere, because it's just useful, and they would be silly not to use it. What I didn't understand when I started Third Eye Spies, and what I think I have a better grasp of now, is that government, namely the intelligence agencies, are not monolithic. You do not know everything when you're in government. Different departments are very highly compartmentalized. They call it stovepiped. The left hand never knows what the right hand is doing, and that's for security reasons. Personally, I believe that all of the well-known remote viewers and scientists are out of the picture these days. They're too public, they're doing their own thing. I don't think that someone like Russel or Hal Puthoff or Joe McMoneagle or any of those people are somehow leading double lives and still working covertly. People like Joe are working very openly for corporations and for big business, oil prospecting, all of those things. It's become an industry unto itself. Companies don't talk about it, but they use it. If you asked me about the lesser known people, though, the scientists that they pulled in from other labs that proved to be damn good at remote viewing, new people that they're bringing in, the people that are out of the limelight, I have reason to believe that they are still doing remote viewing. If only due to the sheer amount of the potential interviews who were lesser known and did not want to come forward for reasons that I can't talk about. But you can learn more about it if you watch Third Eye Spies. So, who are today's preeminent remote viewers? There are a lot of people who are in the remote viewing industry today, but to find them you have to go to places like the International Remote Viewing Association or the Applied Precognition Project, places where the new generation of remote viewers are hanging out. They hold the conference once a year and for IRVA, and the whole crop of viewers are there. And they are not people that you would know. They're people that look just like you and me. They're people who have lives. They're not crazy. They're working for corporations, for police departments, finding missing people. They're contractors for the government. And probably that's where all of the government work has gone. So what's the CIA's current stance on remote viewing? The CIA, I don't believe, has a current stance on remote viewing today because they're not doing it. If they mark a project automatic do not downgrade for years, I believe it would have stayed that way out of embarrassment. Had Russell and his son not actively lobbied Congress to change that. I think that there was a combination of usefulness to them and embarrassment to them, and that they'd had enough of that, and they didn't like the leaks that were coming out, and that created a lot of animosity between different intelligence agencies and how the programs should or should not be used. In terms of any specific government agency, I would almost have to guarantee that they're not doing it. I do think that just like Blackwater or a company like that is doing private military work, I think that private contractors are probably working extensively for government agencies. I think that's the way that they do it. The most important takeaway from this whole subject is that the world is a more connected place than I think any of us realize. If we accept this research into remote viewing, then we also have to look at the world differently. We have to find a sense of ourselves that includes the world as a whole. I believe that it all comes down to a sense of empathy, that if we don't start to think of consciousness as a fundamental part of not just scientists, but of who we are and something that is binding, that binds us together, then I think that we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, and I think that we don't have to. I think that it's because of researchers like Russel Targ and Hal Puthoff and Dean Radin and Daryl Bem and others, we get to stand on the shoulders of giants and get a better look at who we are as human beings. And that is why I made Third Eye Spies, and I'm very happy to share it with you, and thank you for the opportunity for this interview.
My participation in this program, I was there for 10 years. We're describing 20 years of activity at Stanford Research Institute, psychic spying with the CIA. It's all described in the film that we've just released, Third Eye Spies, that talks about our adventures with the CIA during this extraordinary successful period, and I hope you enjoy the film.
If you had an ability to be able to remotely perceive stuff any place in the world, that could be an extraordinary intelligence source.
We found that many individuals are able to accurately describe what's going on in distant locations.
Are you saying that the work you've been doing is classified?
It was a research facility. That was all that we were going to tell them.
The Russians have been spending millions of dollars investigating so-called ESP.
Psychic spies. Almost a psychic arms race here. Is there any real application to this?
I think remote viewing has been demonstrated over the 20 years of work that's been sponsored by the government.
Producing crucial and vital intelligence to the NSA, CIA, DEA, and the Secret Service.
I began to feel frightened.
The KGB did it, man.
What's really going on here? State-sponsored assassination attempt.
The CIA was lying.
They wanted to kill the program.
A storm brewing.
This is real.
I say no more secrets.
Let this information out.